Hello, friends. It is a great honor to be here at the American Philosophical Society. The Philosophical Society, of course, was founded by Ben Franklin in 1743. It was led by Thomas Jefferson from 1797 to 1814. Jefferson considered his election to the Philosophical Society the most flattering incident of my life, and he kept up his presidency while running the United States on the side in the early 1800s. I'm excited to be here because I want to talk with you about an unusual COVID-era reading project that led me to explore what Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson meant when they put that famous phrase in the Declaration of Independence about the pursuit of happiness. And what I learned changed my life. It changed what I think about how to be a good person, about how to be a good citizen, and also how to be a champion for civic education in America. Because I learned that for Franklin and for Jefferson and the other founders, the pursuit of happiness meant not feeling good, but being good. Not the pursuit of immediate pleasure, but the pursuit of long-term virtue. And by virtue, they meant self-improvement, character improvement, lifelong learning, using your powers of reason to moderate or modulate your unreasonable passions and emotions so you could achieve the calm tranquility that allows you to achieve self-mastery and to serve others. In other words, Franklin and Jefferson understood by the pursuit of happiness exactly the same sort of lifelong learning for which they founded the American Philosophical Society, which was designed as a society to inspire communication in the arts and sciences and to promote the cultivation of virtue. So let me tell you about this exciting intellectual journey that I've experienced, and then think with you about what the American Philosophical Society can do with the National Constitution Center and others to inspire civic learning in these challenging times. So here's how the reading project evolved. I noticed during COVID that both Franklin and Jefferson had chosen as their illustration of the central meaning of the pursuit of happiness a book by Cicero that I'd never heard of called the Tusculan Disputations. I discovered the Franklin connection when rereading the part of his autobiography where he talked about his efforts in his 20s to achieve moral perfection. And as you all know from this great project, he made a list of virtues and resolved to conduct self-accounting to see how he'd lived up to them every day. They included temperance, prudence, courage, resolution, cleanliness. He saved the one he found hardest for last, humility. Ba-dum-bum. And he made a graph with the virtues on the x-axis and the days of the week on the y-axis, and he resolved each night to put an X mark next to the virtue where he fell short. He tried this for a while. He found it's incredibly depressing because there are so many X marks. And he gave it up after a few weeks, but he felt that he was better for having tried. I knew about the project. I'd tried it with a friend in DC a few years ago at the suggestion of a local rabbi who recommended the Hebrew version. It was translated into Hebrew by a Hasidic rabbi who admired Franklin in 1808, and it's practiced today as part of the Musar, or character improvement system of Jews. But what I didn't know is that Franklin had chosen as his motto Cicero's Tusculan Disputations, in a passage that said, "Without virtue, happiness cannot be." A few weeks later, I was at the Boar's Head Inn in Charlottesville on the beautiful UVA campus. On the wall of the hotel were a list of 12 virtues or canons of conduct that Jefferson had drafted for his daughters. They look a lot like Franklin's. They include silence, when angry, count to 10, when very angry, 100. And resolution, resolve to do what you ought and do what you resolve. Jefferson oddly left one of Franklin's 13 virtues off his list, and that was chastity. But what struck me was that when Jefferson was asked to illustrate his list, he would also hand out a passage from Cicero's Tusculan Disputations, a longer passage. He'd give it to anyone who asked when he was old about the central meaning of happiness. And he copied it out in his commonplace book when his dad died when he was 14 years old. And the passage from Cicero's Manual on Grief, isn't it remarkable that the central text for happiness in the founding era was a manual about overcoming grief? And Cicero had written it when his own daughter Tullia died, and Jefferson is copying it when his dad dies. The passage says, "He whose soul is tranquilized by restraint and consistency and is at peace with himself, who is neither unduly exuberant or unduly despondent. He is the calm and wise man of whom we are in quest. He is the happy man. So I thought, I've got to read this Cicero because it's so important to Franklin and Jefferson in defining happiness as tranquility of soul and virtue. But what else to read? Then I found this extraordinary reading list that Jefferson would hand out to anyone who asked when he was old how to be educated. And he'd give this to kids who were going to law school or to his friends who were building a private library. It's remarkable both for the scope of the books and for its schedule. The scope includes natural philosophy and astronomy and science and novels. Jefferson loves Richardson and Lawrence Sterne. What caught my eye was the section on moral philosophy. At the top of this section, sometimes he called it natural religion or ethics, Cicero's Tusculan Disputations, then Cicero's On Duties, then Epictetus, Aurelius's Meditations, Seneca's Letters, and Enlightenment moral philosophers, Locke's essay concerning human understanding, Hutcheson, Bolingbroke, Kame, and Hume. What struck me about the list is that I hadn't read any of the books on it. And I've had an extraordinary liberal arts education, and I give thanks every day to the magnificent teachers of literature. I was an English major in college, and history and political philosophy and law who inspired me and continue to inspire me today. But I hadn't read these books of moral philosophy because they'd fallen out of the curriculum when I was in college in the 80s. And I remember yearning for this kind of guidance. I was studying the Puritans with Sack Van Berkovich, the great Puritan scholar who described how the American Jeremiad has defined so much of our rhetorical history, and how just as the ancient Israelites were denounced for forsaking God's covenant, so the Puritan preachers denounced the Puritans for forsaking the word of the Lord, and so the early revolutionaries denounced the Boston congregation for going the way of Greece and Rome by surrendering their liberty for cheap luxury, but there's always the promise of hope and redemption. And I was studying Puritan theology at the same time, and I found myself unsatisfied by the notion that salvation could only be obtained by, not even by faith or good works, but by God's randomly given grace, which couldn't be affected by any amount of human will. This wasn't doing it for me, first because I'm Jewish, and also because it seemed unsatisfying for a life dedicated to seek virtue by reason rather than by faith or grace. And what I didn't realize, because these great books had fallen out of the curriculum, is this is exactly, of course, the question the classical moral philosophers set out to answer. The other thing that inspired me about Jefferson's list is the schedule. He said, you got to get up every morning before dawn, spend 2 hours reading moral philosophy, watch the sunrise, then political philosophy and history in the morning while the mind is still fresh, then lunch, then you save the science and math for the early afternoon until dinner, then you're allowed some Shakespeare and poetry for mild amusement and rational joy, and then to bed 12 hours a day, 7 days a week, no breaks. So I don't know what got into me. It was COVID. I thought I've got more time. I've got to read these books. It was really just to fill a gap in my education. I tried the schedule, not the whole thing, but the morning. I got up every morning 2 hours before the sunrise. I read the moral philosophy. I watched the sunrise every day, which remains the most spectacularly beautiful gift that you can give yourself any day. I found myself writing these sonnets to sum up the wisdom of the morning reading, which is incredibly weird, but it turns out all sorts of people in the founding era wrote sonnets to sum up the classical wisdom, including the great Phyllis Wheatley, the first published black poet whose genius was acclaimed by Washington, and John Quincy Adams, who would read Tusculan's Disputations in the original, his favorite book, in the White House and the Bible, write astonishing sonnets, including of abolitionism, and then walk along the Potomac. So that's what I did for a year, with no other goal than just to fill a gap in my education. But the reading changed my life, and I did indeed learn that for the founders, happiness meant self-mastery, virtue, self-improvement, character improvement. Today we might call it emotional intelligence, but it's essentially being a lifelong learner. But in particular, reading the moral philosophers helped me understand the moral psychology at the core of the project. Much of it went back to Pythagoras. I didn't know that in addition to inventing the triangle and the harmonic system, Pythagoras was a guru who lived on the island of Croton, who counseled rigorous vegetarianism and moderation in all things, and who distinguished the soul into three faculties or powers: reason in the head, passion or emotion in the heart, and desire in the stomach, and said that our goal is to use our powers of reason to moderate or modulate our unreasonable passions and emotions so we can achieve that calm tranquility of soul that later philosophers said defined virtue. I understood in a new light the chart at the end of the Nicomachean Ethics. Remember, Aristotle famously defines happiness as an activity of the soul in conformity with excellence or virtue. Eudaimonia, good demon, eudaimonian ethics. But I couldn't get it into my head what you're supposed to do until you see the chart at the end, and for every passion or emotion, there's an excess and a deficiency. So the goal is not exuberance or despondency, but moderation. And I now see that it's essentially a psychological product to avoid the perturbations of the mind, not to be distracted by perseverating about the past and the future, and not to allow yourself to indulge in unproductive emotions like anger, jealousy, ambition, and fear, so you can achieve productive emotions like the classical virtues, prudence, temperance, courage, and justice, and attain the tranquility that defines virtue and happiness. It also came home to me with two modern examples. It's a version of the marshmallow test at Stanford. The kids who were asked, if they want one marshmallow immediately, they get one. If they can wait for 15 minutes, they get two. And the kids who could wait did better in school and better in later life. And then Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg told me in one of the interviews that I was honored to have with her that her mom, central advice to her was two things: first, be independent, and then be a lady. And by be a lady, she meant avoid unproductive emotions like anger, jealousy, and fear. They will distract you from productive work. And that classical idea that being a lady or a gentleman in the classical, not the aristocratic sense, meant self-possession, self-mastery, self-improvement, character improvement was the essence of the classical wisdom. So that is the understanding of the pursuit of happiness that prevailed for so much of American history. It made its way from the Declaration into the Constitution, where Madison's distinguished between reason and passion as the definition of faction and tries to set up a system to avoid the hasty formation of mobs. It's expressed in the Federalist Papers, which is a manual for public happiness, to use a phrase that Madison and Hamilton use repeatedly, and I hadn't noticed before. It's expressed by Tocqueville's idea of self-interest properly understood, where, channeling and reading Cicero, he also talks about the need for self-mastery and a virtuous citizenry. It ends up in books like The McGuffey Reader and The Columbian Orator, which inspired Frederick Douglass, who bought reading lessons on the streets of Baltimore with bread and then purchased this book with bread and read excerpts from Cicero and Franklin and Seneca and a dialogue on slavery and turned himself into the greatest abolitionist of his time. And then it persisted in the early 20th century. My mom and Justice Ginsburg were born the same year and both went to New York public schools in Brooklyn, and they got it in their McGuffey readers and the textbooks of the time, and then it fell out of the curriculum in the 60s when the definition of happiness was transformed from being good to feeling good, from self-restraint to self-gratification. And that's a complicated story about why that happened, but it's obvious that once pop culture began to celebrate hedonism and materialism and not self-mastery and self-restraint, the definition of happiness changed. The Happiness book tries to ask how the founders applied these lessons in their lives, and I'll just focus on how they applied it in their educational philosophy, because that's so central to the foundation of APS. Franklin, after having come up with his virtue project, founded a series of institutions in Philadelphia to inspire the cultivation of self-mastery and virtue. And APS was designed to ensure communication among, he called them the virtuosi, men, ingenious men from across the country and world who needed communications technology to be able to share their ideas, to cultivate information about the arts and sciences. But he also, in 1728, had founded the Junto, the club to join, which was designed to inspire virtuous learning. It was a kind of reading group for his friends. He writes the Constitution from Locke's essay on education, which is designed for the promotion of virtue. Incidentally, the central definition of happiness, this is hiding in plain sight in Samuel Johnson's 1755 dictionary, two definitions: one, the Old English hap or luck; the second, the rational contraction of desire so that you can meet it. The footnote is to Locke's Essay Concerning Human Understanding, Book 51, which defines the pursuit of happiness as the mastering of reason with passion. It was just literally hiding there in plain sight how the founders understood happiness, and Locke writes a manual for education and recommends that people get together and have self-improvement groups to do self-accounting of their efforts to achieve virtue. And that's what Franklin recommends. The Constitution asks questions, which he takes from Locke, without citation as it happens, asking what virtuous event have you described today? What vice? How can you promote virtue and avoid vice? And Franklin dreams of creating a united party for virtue, essentially a bunch of adult reading groups across the land that, like the APS, which he founds as a add-on to the Junto in the same spirit, will promote virtue. And then when he writes the first curriculum for the University of Pennsylvania, the main moral textbook that he recommends is by Samuel Johnson, not the British guy. They always get confused, but the moral philosopher, father of the Connecticut founding father at the convention. And you just do word searches because all these texts are online. He's constantly, on the first page and throughout the volumes, talking about the pursuit of happiness, which he defines as character improvement and virtuous self-mastery. And the whole curriculum is designed to inspire this in kids across the country. So that's Franklin. And isn't it amazing that at the end of his long life, he considered his greatest achievement, the great Franklin, the greatest man in the world, his greatest achievement is his tranquility of temperament, his conciliating temper that led him not to say tendentiously, my way or the highway, but it may be so, or perhaps, or it seems to me. That's what allows him at the Constitutional Convention to persuade people to make it unanimous, even though he knows that they have objections, and to be the greatest diplomat of his age. And then Jefferson, who, of course, falls short of so many of his ideals, most notoriously slavery, and there's much to say about that, including the fact that he perceived it, his own hypocrisy in classical terms, and recognized that it was his own avarice or greed, to use the classical terms, that led him to denounce slavery as immoral and at the same time to be unable to give up the lifestyle that it made possible because he liked it, and he was addicted to luxury and didn't want to free himself of that vice. But Jefferson puts on his tombstone the three achievements, not the presidency, although he no doubt prized his APS presidency highly, but writing the Declaration, writing the Virginia Declaration of Rights, and UVA. And his hope for democracy is the cultivation of a natural aristocracy, not a hereditary one. He has such a fierce enmity toward the inherited distinctions which subverted the ancient English liberties that he traced back to the mists of the Saxon woads. But he hopes that in this new democracy, universal education will inspire first the boys of best genius and then others to cultivate their faculties of reason so that universal reason can suffuse across the land. John Adams, in the most moving exchange in American letters, they're old and they've fallen out over politics. They get back together. What do they want to talk about? Comparative moral philosophy and education. Adams is so excited when he learns that Pythagoras, the founder of Greek moral philosophy, may have traveled to the East and read the Hindu Vedas, and he thinks if this can just be proven, it will show that the essential element of the East and West is similar. We are what we think. Life is shaped by the mind. Adams signals the passage in the Bhagavad Gita, renounce and enjoy, renounce attachment to external events and enjoy eternal salvation, and notes with his incredible deep reading that this is the same as the Stoic dichotomy of control, which says don't try to control the thoughts or emotions of others, only focus on controlling your own thoughts and emotions. And Jefferson says at the end of his long life, he's concluded he's no longer a Stoic, but an Epicurean, by which he means not a hedonist or wanton pleasure seeker, that's a libel on Epicurus, but the rational contraction of desires so they can be met. But they disagree about whether or not education is possible on a large scale. And Jefferson dreams of the perfectibility of man, and Adams scorns his starry-eyed faith in reason and says never since all of human history has man been perfected and we're fallen, and he's a follower of Polybius and thinks that all just aristocracies and oligarchies and democracies give way to their inferior forms of tyrannies and oligarchies and the mob. Both Jefferson and Adams, like all the founders, are centrally concerned about a Caesar that will subvert democracy, consolidate power, undermine the separation of powers, and that America will go the way of Greece and Rome. My new book, which is coming out in October, is about, it's called The Pursuit of Liberty, how Hamilton versus Jefferson ignited the lasting battle over power in America. And it begins with this incredible dinner party, not the one where they moved the capital from D.C. to the Potomac, the one in the musical, but a year later, they're in Philly, and at Washington's away, they're having a convivial working dinner. Hamilton looks around the room and says to Jefferson, who are those three guys on the wall? Those are my three visions of the greatest men in history, John Locke, Francis Bacon, and Isaac Newton. Hamilton pauses and says, the greatest man in the world was Julius Caesar. And Jefferson writes, this proves that Hamilton is for a monarchy bottomed on corruption, and then founds the Democratic Party in opposition to the supposed Caesarism and monarchism of Adams and the Federalists, leading to a polarization that will afflict American history until the end. Hamilton was almost certainly joking because he's always warning of the dangers of a Caesar who will court the people from below, flatter the mob, as in Shays' Rebellion, and install a dictatorship. Jefferson is concerned about a Caesar from above. He worries about a president in the distant future who will lose an election by a few votes, his exact words when he gets a copy of the Constitution, refuse to leave office, and install himself as a permanent dictator. They both, though, are dedicated to the separation of powers and committed to the possibility of civic education as a way of preserving the Republic. And for the rest of American history, political parties and justices invoke Hamilton and Jefferson by name as they debate the great issues of national power versus states' rights, liberal versus strict construction of the Constitution, and democracy versus rule by elites. Friends, we're obviously living in a testing time where some fear that the founders' fears have come to pass and that Caesarism is replete in America. And a combination of the subversion of the separation of powers, which has been a long time in the making, including the vast explosion of executive power with a populist presidency, the shrinking of a Congress that is not performing its checking function, and a judiciary increasingly deferential to claims of a unitary executive, may, in the fears of some, be fulfilling the founders' fears. We don't know what the future will bring, but we do know about that the founders thought that the whole thing would collapse without virtue and civic education. And by that they meant individual self-mastery and taming our passions and not trying to own the libs or own the conservatives and being our most partisan and expressive selves, but being moderate and being self-composed and listening to the other side and disagreeing without being disagreeable. That beautiful scene, Hamilton dies, Jefferson places his bust in Monticello across from his own, and you can see it today, and when he would pass it, he would smile and say, opposed in life as in death. Not a hated enemy, but a respected enemy, respected adversary to be engaged. So what is to be done? I want to just say quickly, it's obvious that the age of social media is the antithesis of the calm moderation, temperance, prudence, and justice. And Madison and Jefferson had such faith in the new technologies of broadside press that would let citizens read the Federalist Papers in the original and talk about it with their representatives, and reason would slowly spread across the land. And of course, our world of Instagram and X and Enraged to Engage is in many ways the founders' media nightmare. But at the same time, there's a gleaming ray of hope. It is so exciting. We're so gloriously lucky to live in an age when all the books in the world are free and online. And it just blows my mind that I was able to do all of this marvelous reading just lying on my couch, reading these beautiful books, either in the original or free texts. All we need is the self-discipline to read them. And that's why the greatest challenge to our civic life today is that people are not reading anymore. And not just the least privileged. The most privileged among us are not reading books. And we have it in our power to, I've become an evangelist for the transformative power of deep reading, and we have to model it ourselves. And for me, the biggest takeaway from that crazy COVID reading was I got back into the habit of reading every day. I'd fallen out of the habit. I read in college, I read for my deadlines, but because I'm addicted to these screens, I'd stopped reading books. So my new rule is when I wake up, I'm not allowed to browse or surf until I read. And it's not always 2 hours before sunrise, but it's just remarkable. It's so exciting I read John Newman on the idea of the university this morning, and Rick Levin knows it's just, and that's really the Franklin classical faith too, about the possibility of daily cultivation and self-mastery and learning and growing for its own sake, because that's to unite with the divine. So back to APS, that is why your mission is so sacred, and your opportunity as a group of lifelong learners is so meaningful. How lucky you are to convene for a couple days and learn about disciplines different from your own for no other sake than for the joy of lifelong learning. This is the highest privilege that any of us can enjoy as citizens. I am so honored to be here. I'm so looking forward to our learning together, and let's take the light from this glorious learned society and inspire civic learning across America. Thank you so much. Great.
Time is upon us, but I think we have enough time for at least one question, or maybe two, if they're short. And please, someone bring a microphone and say your name and where you're from.
Ted Steinbach from Louisville, Kentucky, and I want to thank you for bringing to us the importance of liberal education with a small L. My question or comment to you is, here in Philadelphia, the physician humanist Sir William Osler spoke about equanimitas. Can you speak to that as one of the virtues?
Thank you so much. I think I was named Jeffrey for Jeffrey Osler, who was related to William Osler, and your Kentucky roots bring to mind one of my great heroes, Louis Brandeis, of course, who was such an Athenian and so devoted to this classical vision and considered 5th century Athens to be the apotheosis of the time of creating a perfect citizen in a perfect state. And equanimitas is exactly the definition of the first of the Aristotelian virtues. It's all about moderation, and it's temperance. And it's so interesting that both the classical and the Christian, both the later church fathers like Aquinas, who I think Osler maybe, I think Equanimous may be from that, and the natural religion advocates like Wurlitzen and Tillotson, all view a temperance as a synonym for virtue. And Adam Smith defines virtue as temperance because the roots are the same, and therefore equanimitas, like temperance, is itself a representation of the harmony of the souls. That's the extraordinary thing. You're trying to seek the same harmony in the constitution of the state as you seek in the constitution of your own mind. And only when reason, passion, and desire are aligned in that sense of a soul tranquilized by restraint and consistency, to use the Cicero language, can you achieve the equanimity that allows you to overcome your ego-based emotions and to connect to the divine, to the light within all, to the universal, subspecie eternitatis. It's the whole idea of the eternal soul, and you can only connect to it by achieving these virtues of temperament, and that's why it's a kind of temperance. If my Latin were better, I could show the roots of it all, but Smith did, and that's why equanimitas is a beautiful definition of the pursuit of happiness.
I love that.